G'day and welcome back to the channel. So in today's video, I want to show you how you can permanently loosen a tight quadratus lumborum or QL muscle. And while there's an infinite number of QL stretches out there, I don't see too many people actually talking about why the QL is tight in the first place, and then what you need to do to permanently stop that tissue from wanting to be tight going forwards. So let's get into it. So the first thing we need to touch on before we get into any of these exercises and extra information is we need to get a sense of how tight your QL might feel in the first place so that you can instantly see how effective any of these techniques might be for you. And we'll get into this in a little bit more detail, obviously, when we go through how to stretch a tight QL. But what's important to understand about the QL is its anatomy and how we can get a good sense of how tight that might be. So anatomically, the QL muscle generally anchors from the base of that rib cage around that T12 rib, and it feathers into the lumbar spine as it goes down and then inserts into the top of your pelvis. And although traditionally we think of stretching a QL just by the leaning off to the side, but clinically its anatomical shape and position means that we need to bend away from that side, we need to bend forward a little bit, and then we need to rotate back to that same side to best expose some of that QL tightness. So if you can do a version of this in sitting or standing, whatever feels best for you, just take note of how tight or uncomfortable or restricted it feels through that side of your back, and then compare it obviously to the other side. So bending to the side, leaning forward a little bit, twisting back a little bit. For me, it doesn't feel anywhere near as tight on this side as it does in this position. So it's important to take note of A, how far you feel you go, right versus left, but also how tight or restricted it feels in that moment. Because the first exercise we're going to get to isn't trying to stretch the muscle, it's trying to get to the underlying joint stiffnesses that might be causing that muscular tightness in the first place. So once you have established your baseline, we need to go looking for the underlying root cause of what's asking that QL muscle to be tight over time. And for me clinically, because the QL muscle anchors onto your spine and rib cage and your pelvis, if there's any joint restrictions within that area, these can prompt your brain to ask for help from your QL muscle by tightening it up. So if your spinal joints at the base of your rib cage and throughout your lumbar spine, or the rib joints as they attach into that spine have become stiff, tight, and restricted, this can be one of the main foundational reasons behind why that QL is tight. So if you've been a fan of the channel, you'll know that we have some very specific and simple ways to try and address this. And generally that may require you to either have a ball or a lacrosse ball or a foam roller. And we just want you to choose the device that's either the most convenient for you or the one that feels that gives you the best access to this deeper joint stiffness that we're about to try and find. So for me, I'm going to ditch the lacrosse ball for today. I'm going to take my foam roller. And again, we're going to start at the base of your rib cage and just systematically work our way down just to get a sense of whereabouts you might be stiff, but also which side of your spine might be the stiffest for you. So what we want to get you to do is we'll start at the base of that rib cage for me. And again, as I always say on the channel, we're not here to roll around on your tissue. What we're trying to do with this roller is we're trying to get underneath that muscular tightness to look for anything spinal or rib joint that might be stiff, rusty, or restricted. And you won't be able to find it unless you go looking for it. So again, you have a choice here. You can either have your bottom on the ground, hands behind your head, move the roller up and down until you feel you hit a segment that feels a bit stiffer or harder. The other option is to bridge your bottom up, have your head on the ground, and do it from that position as well. But the ultimate idea that we're looking for is that once you've found the segment that maybe feels a little bit stiff for you, you want to gently tension yourself up, but we also want to make sure that we roll from one side to the other to get the best sense of which side feels the hardest, the stiffest, the tightest, and the most restricted, not necessarily the side that feels the most tender or uncomfortable. Because the goal here is that even if you feel you have a bunch of QL tightness on your right-hand side, or you feel like when you did your QL test before that the right side felt tighter, if you find that the joints underneath on the left-hand side are stiffer, then that's actually the side that we want to try and mobilize, because it could be the handbrake that is affecting both sides. So we want to make sure that we're not missing it just because you feel tighter on one side compared to the other. But for me, as always, the left-hand side of my spine feels a fraction stiffer here. It's also the side where my QL felt the tightest. Again, it's probably no coincidence. But then all we're trying to do is once you've tensioned up that enough, want to make sure that you can take a deep breath or two in this position, but we just want to stay here and allow the roller or the ball to respectfully press into these areas, asking them to mobilize. Once you've spent 30 seconds or a minute, or as long as you feel comfortable at a level that feels comfortable for you, we then want to move the roller up a little bit or down a little bit and go looking for the next best version of that tightness that you can find. Again, you can have your hips up and tension it from the bottom. But ultimately, we're just trying to find a spot that feels restricted. We want to stay here for 30 seconds to a minute or until you feel it stops giving. And then we want to systematically work our way up and down from that point, capturing every spinal level and every spinal joint and rib joint that might be contributing to some of that QL restriction. And as I said before, what we need to immediately do is then if we can then reassess your QL muscle stretch. For me, it doesn't feel anywhere near as tight as it did before. I feel like I can now go a little bit deeper until I can find that particular spot that feels tight. So if you have found one or two specific joints at the base of your rib cage, the top of your lower back, that feel the stiffest and the tightest, and when you release those and free those up, you feel like your QL muscle has instantly improved. There has to be a reason why those exact segments and those exact joints on that exact side have become stiff, tight, and restricted. And again, we'll come back to what that might be for you at the end of this video. So again, once you have mobilized any of those deeper underlying joint restrictions, we need to give you a really good QL muscle stretch to treat the symptom of what's actually there. And again, there's a million different ways that you can potentially stretch your QL, which is essentially the same thing that we just did to expose how tight it maybe was in the first place. But what we need to do is apply certain techniques to that position to make the ability to immediately mobilize that tight musculature all the more effective. So essentially how it looks, again, if we remember that just bending to one side may put some tension through the QL, but because it has some capacity to move your spine in different directions, we do need to add a little bit of flexibility and a little bit of contralateral or opposite rotation into the mix to truly expose the most of that tightness. So again, what we want to get you to do is just bend off to the side, lean forward a little bit, then rotate back to that same side. And again, I like to have my elbow on my legs to really pull me into that position further, but we want to go into those versions as best as we can. Now again, if you're someone who finds it hard to sit cross-legged on the floor, you're welcome to do this sitting on a chair. You can do it resting on an armrest. Choose the position that feels the most comfortable and the most achievable for you. But for me, because I'm relatively flexible, I do need to get into a position like this to truly expose that tightness. Now, the key with this position though, is that traditional stretching, where we just hold this position for 30 seconds to a minute, it is nowhere near as effective as we both want it to be, and it needs to be to promote change. So instead of holding this position for 30 seconds to a minute and hoping that that QL tissue starts to give, what we need to do instead is we need to find a way to tense up that QL spot, that tight spot that we found. We need to tense it up for 5 to 10 seconds. This may mean squeezing your butt. This may mean just squeezing all the musculature in your back. It doesn't matter. Because what this does, it creates a reflex in your brain that when you stop tensing, that tissue will reflexively relax a little bit. And then you should find that you can go even further into that stretch before you find maybe the same level of tightness. And then all it is just a process of tensing that tissue as hard as you can for 5 seconds, relaxing, letting it give, going further and further and further until you either get sick of it or you stop making change. Now, it does look a little bit strange that it sort of looks like I'm twisting myself into a pretzel in that position, but I'm just following the movements that I need to get into to expose some of that tightness. So for you, clearly, if you've come to this video, you may be a decent amount tighter than me, but just get to the point where you feel some genuine tightness, squeeze the life out of it for 5 to 10 seconds, relax, let it give, and keep going further. So again, getting back into this original shape again, if I bend off to the side, I bend forward, and I twist, I feel a little bit of tightness. This time I feel like I need to go a decent amount further and get my elbow onto the ground before I even start to find some of that tightness. And again, that position may look ridiculous. It's just the end product of where I need to be to find that tightness. But from where I started in this video to where I am now, by mobilizing those stiff joints and by genuinely freeing up that QL tissue, I've automatically loosened up my back substantially based on how it feels to me. And visually, hopefully it looks the same for you. But as I said before, just stretching that tissue on its own may never get you to the stage where you never have to keep stretching that tissue if we're not also getting to the underlying cause of what's asking that tissue to be tight in the first place. And then the other thing that we need to account for is that by strengthening that tissue, we can essentially try and replace some muscular tightness and some joint stiffness with more strength and stability. Now, the interesting thing about the QL is because it attaches to your rib cage and down to your pelvis, we have two different ways that we can strengthen the muscle. One is by keeping our top half steady and doing a hip hike. We're trying to pull that hip up as high as we can, asking that QL to function. But this particular exercise exercise is a little bit harder to scale because you might need to put a weight on your leg or a band, which can be a little bit awkward for some people. But the other version of that is the reverse, where we keep your legs stable. We just think of tilting from side to side. Now, obviously this is easier to scale because we can grab a weight, and depending on the side that you're trying to work. So for me, if I'm trying to do my left-hand side, I can start down low, so I really lengthen that tissue. I can use that tissue to pull me up to the side and all the way over just to complete the full range of motion of that exercise. So an easy way to do this officially is to stand up comfortably tall, good posture. If you squeeze your glutes, this puts your pelvis in a good position. We don't necessarily want you to do it from an anteriorly tilted position. You can just change the dynamics of the exercise slightly. But again, up nice and tall, good posture, legs apart, belly drawn in. Then we want to lower the weight down towards the side of your foot, as far as you feel comfortable. And then maintaining that straight back in that same plane to begin with, we can then tense the muscle, the QL muscle, to bring us all the way up and then over again to go as far as we can in this direction. So for most people, the best place to start is just to go down as far as you feel comfortable, trying not to bend forward at all, just trying to make it as pure lateral flexion as you can, as far as you feel comfortable going. But once you've done this a few times, maybe after a couple of days, we can then start to explore what it looks like to bend to the side and forward a little bit. So instead of just going purely into that lateral flexed position, all the way down, all the way up, and essentially trying to slide the weight down the side of our leg, we can gently and respectfully, being up nice and tall, start to see how it feels to almost bend to the side and then bend forward towards the little toe. And then again, coming all the way back and then all the way over in that new plane that we've created. And as we mentioned before, because the QL isn't just a lateral flexor, there is some element of flexion and rotation at the same time. At some stage, we do want to get to the stage where we are practicing that lateral flexion with a bit of flexion and some rotation at the same time, and then doing the opposite of that to really try and work that muscle specifically. But again, if you've had back pain or this is a new exercise or a new movement pattern for you, start really simply. Do your 3 sets of 10, your 3 sets of 12. Try and find some fatigue, again, not stopping in the midline, but going all the way across, just to get that QL to work to its full capacity. Once you feel very comfortable with this and you're looking for the next challenge, then try and make it a little bit more of a flexed position as well. Again, we have demonized flexion, so please don't be worried about bending forwards. As long as it's a global bend and you're not kicking a hinge into your spine consistently, it's important to keep reassuring people that lumbar flexion is a normal aspect of normal spinal function. And then once you've been able to do your lateral flexion with some flexion, again going towards your little toe, then we can really emphasize the rotation at the same time, where you're starting to twist your shoulders to the back corner, but making sure that you're doing that controlled motion as much as you can. And hopefully after that 10 to 12 rep range without weight to begin with, then adding weight into the mix as you feel like you can tolerate that. We're looking for that genuine fatigue through the side of that spine. Now, as I said before, if you do any of these exercises, especially this more nuanced version, make sure that you do it at a level that feels very comfortable and very controlled and very safe for you. But again, if you're unsure, please see someone specifically. But as I mentioned, at some stage, we want to try and find a way to strengthen those tissues to assist in the process of stopping this from wanting to tighten again in the future. And then the final thing that we need to talk about is that once you've done those things, we need to try and understand why we're doing those things in the first place so that you don't have to keep doing them long term into the future. So once you've mobilized those stiff joints, you've found an effective way to stretch that QL, and you've been able to generate some fatigue through your QL with those exercises, we now need to talk about why we're even having this conversation in the first place. And as I alluded to before, if you found that there are some specifically stiff joints in your spine, and when you release those stiffnesses, your QL muscle also feels looser, there has to be a genuine reason why that exact part of your spine on that side, in that area, has become stiff, tight, and restricted. And if you've been a follower of these types of videos before, you'll hopefully understand that the single biggest cause that I find clinically that helps me better understand why my patients are dealing with spinal dysfunction in any capacity, let alone for the context of this video, is that we need to pay attention to the shapes, the positions, and the postures that you put that tissue into the most throughout your day. And in my clinical experience, that doesn't generally relate to the active, interesting things. It's often more of a reflection of the stationary, sedentary type shapes that we get into. So if you are someone who spends any length of time throughout your day, sitting at a desk, sitting at a couch, driving a car, standing, bending over a desk or a bench, or you're out gardening or something like that, the area that you have found that has become stiff, tight, and restricted is very likely to be the section of your back that you might be unknowingly hinging through or relaxing through or bending through for the majority of the time that you're in that shape. And because the body is an adaptive piece of machinery, if you put a hinge through your spine for long enough, your brain then starts to need to stiffen and tighten and restrict that area to allow you to either do it better or to support or protect the things that you are doing in that moment. So what I try and get across to my patients is if we can't pair up all the techniques that hopefully make you feel looser with improved awareness of how you're then positioning that tissue throughout the day, then you may never get to the stage where you've permanently fixed this and that you don't have to keep stretching and mobilizing that tissue indefinitely. Because if we can take the hinge out of your spine and treat your spine as a whole, so we're not segmentally isolating anything, potentially if there's a little bit of a twist in there as well, if you like to sit in a certain position on the couch, or the mouse drags you into it, or the steering wheel or something changes the symmetry of that position as well. If we can't bring you back into a more symmetrical upright shape for the majority of the time that you're doing that activity, then we're just leaving the door open for that dysfunction to persist. So as always, I genuinely hope that that was helpful and insightful. If it was, please let me know in the comments down below. If this was helpful for you, please let me know by leaving a like rating on the video. Subscribe to the channel if you want more of this type of content. But as always, I genuinely hope that that was helpful. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.